The sun was setting over Jerusalem, dyeing the white walls of the holy city in golden hues. In the cenacle, a spacious room on the upper floor of a house on Mount Zion, Jesus gathered with his 12 apostles to celebrate Passover. The atmosphere was filled with solemn anticipation. The oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the attentive faces of the disciples, who sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen that night. With deliberate and precise movements, Jesus took the unleavened bread in his hands. His fingers, which would soon be pierced by nails, broke it gently. His eyes, which in just a few hours would be swollen by the blows, looked at each of his apostles with an indescribable love. "Take and eat, this is my body that will be given for you," he declared in a clear, firm voice. Then lifting the red wine cup that shone in the lamplight, he added, "Drink all of it, for this is my blood, the blood of the new covenant, which will be shed for you and many for the forgiveness of sins." Meanwhile, within Judas Iscariot's heart, a terrible battle was raging. The demon had entered him, whispering thoughts of greed and betrayal. His fingers nervously toyed with the pouch hanging from his belt, where he would soon store the 30 pieces of silver, the price of his infamy. His eyes avoided the penetrating gaze of the master, who knew perfectly well what his disciple was plotting. "What you must do it quickly," Jesus told him at one point. Judas rose and hurried out into the dark night, leaving behind the warmth and light of the cenacle. After the meal, Jesus spoke to his disciples with words of farewell, full of love and comfort. He told them about the Holy Spirit he would send, about the commandments they were to keep, and about the love they should have for one another. His words flowed like a gentle river, depositing within their hearts a spiritual testament that they would remember in the dark days that lay ahead. The faces of the apostles revealed confusion and sorrow. They sensed an imminent separation but did not understand its true scope. Meanwhile, Judas made his way through the narrow streets of Jerusalem toward the palace of the high priest Caiaphas. The full moon of Nisan illuminated his path, casting his long shadow over the white walls. In his mind, the words of the Pharisees echoed, "What will you give me if I deliver him to you?" The clinking of the silver coins mingled in his imagination with memories of 3 years spent with the Master, his teachings, his miracles, his infinite goodness. But greed and resentment had formed a hard crust around his heart. There was no turning back now. The plan was already in motion. Chapter 2. The Agony in Gethsemane. After singing the Paschal hymns, Jesus and his disciples left the cenacle and headed for the Mount of Olives. The night was clear, illuminated by the full moon, which cast long shadows on the rocky path. The cool spring air carried the scent of olive trees and night flowers. They crossed the Kidron stream, whose murmuring waters seemed to foreshadow, with their sound, the tears the Savior would soon shed. Arriving at the Garden of Gethsemane, an enclosure surrounded by ancient olive trees, Jesus left 8 of his disciples near the entrance. "Sit here while I go over there and pray," he told them with a voice that betrayed deep anguish. Taking Peter, James, and John with him, he ventured further into the garden. His face, usually serene, began to show signs of an indescribable affliction. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me," he confided to the 3, before stepping away to a distance of a stone's throw. In a small, natural grotto, partially hidden by vegetation, Jesus fell to his knees. His body, which would soon be torn by the lashes, already trembled beneath the weight of an overwhelming vision. Before his eyes paraded, in an endless procession, all the sins of humanity from Adam up to the very last human being who would ever walk the earth. Every impure thought, every hurtful word, every act of violence or injustice fell upon him like an overwhelming burden. Demonic figures danced around him, showing in cruel detail the consequences of sin, families destroyed, innocents suffering, souls lost in eternal darkness. "My Father," Jesus groaned with his face to the ground, "if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." His forehead began to glisten with a strange, thick, reddish sweat. As the agony intensified, those droplets turned to blood, falling heavily onto the dusty earth to form small, dark puddles. The very ground seemed to shudder as it received that precious liquid, hinting at the greater outpouring yet to come. Meanwhile, the three apostles struggled against sleep. Their heavy eyelids closed despite their efforts to stay awake. When Jesus returned to them, he found them asleep. "Were you not able to keep watch with me for even 1 hour?" he asked them with infinite sadness. "Watch and pray, so that you do not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He returned to them 3 times, and 3 times he found them overcome by sleep. In his third agony, a luminous angel descended from heaven to comfort him, offering him a mystical cup that symbolized the divine acceptance of his sacrifice. With renewed determination, though his pain remained, Jesus rose to face what was coming. The moment of his betrayal had arrived. Chapter 3. The Betrayal, Kiss, and the Arrest. The nocturnal silence of the Garden of Gethsemane was abruptly interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, the clattering of arms, and the glare of torches moving among the olive trees like malevolent fireflies. A cohort of Roman soldiers, accompanied by temple guards and constables sent by the high priests, advanced following Judas Iscariot. The faces of the men, illuminated by the flickering firelight, showed a mix of determination, curiosity, and a certain superstitious fear regarding the mission to arrest this Galilean, of whom so many prodigies were told. Jesus, having just finished his agony in the grotto, went to the 3 sleeping apostles and gently woke them. "Get up, come on. The one who will betray me is near," he said with a surprising serenity, as if he were not the victim, but the orchestrator of the events that were about to unfold. Peter, startled awake, instinctively reached for the hilt of his sword. The other disciples, who were resting at a short distance, began gathering together, alerted by the noise and the approaching lights. Judas had given the soldiers a signal. "The one I kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away carefully." The kiss, a universal symbol of affection and respect, thus became the bitterest of betrayals. Moving ahead of the armed group, Judas approached Jesus with a hesitant but determined step. The light of the torches revealed his face contorted in a forced smile, while his eyes avoided the penetrating gaze of his master. "Greetings, Rabbi," he exclaimed, and bowed to kiss him on the cheek. The contact of their lips on Jesus' skin seemed to burn him like red-hot iron, but there was no turning back. "Friend, do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" Jesus responded with a voice mixing sadness and compassion without the slightest trace of anger or reproach. Then, stepping forward, he asked the armed crowd, "Who are you looking for?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they answered. "I am," he affirmed with such majesty that the soldiers involuntarily stepped back and fell to the ground as if struck by some invisible power. This momentary manifestation of his divinity did not intend to prevent his arrest, but rather to show that he was surrendering freely of his own will. When the guards had regrouped, he repeated his question and answer, adding, "If you are looking for me, let these go." At that moment, the impulsive Peter, unable to contain his indignation at what was happening, drew his sword and with a quick, albeit clumsy motion, cut off the right ear of Malchus, a servant of the high priest. Blood began to well from the wound as the man cried out in pain. In a final act of mercy, before surrendering to suffering, Jesus reached out to Malchus and touched his wound, which was immediately healed. "Put your sword back in its place," he ordered Peter, "for all who draw the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, who would immediately put more than 12 legions of angels at my disposal?" While the soldiers bound Jesus with ropes and treated him with unnecessary brutality, the disciples began to scatter into the darkness, overcome by fear. Those who had sworn to follow him even unto death now fled to save their own lives. Peter and John, however, followed the group at a distance, unable to completely abandon their master. With his hands bound and roughly pushed by the guards, Jesus thus began his painful journey toward Jerusalem, along the same path he had walked so often to teach in the temple. The full moon, silent witness to his agony in the garden, now illuminated his face, filled with dignity and resolve, as he was led away like a criminal. Chapter 4. The trial before Ananias and Caiaphas. The group carrying the captured Jesus entered Jerusalem through a small gate near Mount Zion, advancing through narrow streets barely lit by the moon. The inhabitants of the city, exhausted after the celebrations of the first day of Passover, slept unaware of the drama unfolding in their streets. The nocturnal silence was broken only by the metallic clamor of arms, the murmur of soldiers' conversations, and the sound of sandals against stone. First, they led Jesus to the house of Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, and a former high priest who still wielded great influence in the Sanhedrin. The elderly man waited in a well-lit room, seated on a kind of raised platform, surrounded by scribes and Pharisees whose faces betrayed a mix of curiosity, disdain, and contained anxiety. When the guards pushed Jesus into the center of the room, Annas observed him with a cruel smile. He had long awaited this moment. Now the Galilean preacher who dared criticize the religious authorities was in his hands. "What is your teaching? Who are your disciples?" Annas asked with feigned cordiality. His eyes, sunk into a face wrinkled by age and malice, scrutinized the prisoner for any sign of fear or doubt. But Jesus, despite the visible weariness and bruises on his face, maintained a commanding dignity. "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogue and in the temple, where all the Jews come together, and I have said nothing in secret. Why do you interrogate me? Ask those who have heard me. They know what I have said," he replied calmly. One of the guards, interpreting these words as a lack of respect toward the former high priest, quickly approached and struck Jesus in the face with his metal-gloved hand. The sound of the blow echoed through the room like a lash. "Is this how you answer the high priest?" the guard shouted, as a trickle of blood began to run from the corner of Jesus' lips. "If I have spoken wrongly, testify as to what is wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" was the calm response of the Savior, whose eyes showed not anger, but profound compassion for his executioners. Frustrated by his inability to trap Jesus in a contradiction, Annas ordered that he be taken to the house of Caiaphas, where many members of the Sanhedrin had already gathered despite the late hour. Caiaphas's palace was more imposing, with a spacious inner courtyard surrounded by columns where large braziers burned to stave off the night's chill. Peter and John had managed to enter the courtyard, John thanks to his acquaintances in the house, and Peter because the guards briefly hesitated at the door. In the courtroom, Caiaphas waited impatiently, dressed in his priestly robes. Unlike Annas's private interrogation, this was a formal Sanhedrin session, albeit held illegally at night. False witnesses succeeded one another, contradicting each other as they attempted to present accusations against Jesus. Caiaphas' frustration visibly grew with each inconsistent testimony until he finally rose with a face flushed with anger. "Do you not answer at all to these things they testify against you?" he almost shouted. Jesus remained silent, fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah. Like a lamb led to slaughter, he did not open his mouth. Chapter 5. Peter's denials and the condemnation. In the courtyard of Caiaphas's palace, Peter approached trembling a brazier where several guards and servants sought warmth on the cool Jerusalem night. The flames cast dancing shadows on the white walls and intermittently revealed the faces of those present. Peter tried to remain unnoticed, but his Galilean accent and evident nervousness betrayed him. A servant girl looked at him curiously, and drawing closer to see his face better in the flickering light, exclaimed, "You were with Jesus the Galilean too." Peter's heart skipped a beat. His mind, clouded by fear, momentarily forgot all his promises of loyalty unto death. "I don't know what you mean," he replied in a trembling voice, too loud to be convincing. Trying to escape inquisitive glances, he moved toward the inner hall. There, another maid recognized him and said to those nearby, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." This time, Peter denied it with an oath. "I do not know that man." His face, once brave and determined, now displayed the terror of someone cornered. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the trial proceeded on its predetermined course. Caiaphas, exasperated by Jesus' silence in the face of incoherent accusations, decided to compel him to speak. Rising from his seat with theatrical solemnity, he stared intently at the prisoner and pronounced the most solemn injunction in the Jewish tradition. "I adjure you by the living God to tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of God?" An absolute silence fell over the room. All eyes were fixed on Jesus, who raised his head and answered in a clear, firm voice, "You have said so. And also I tell you that you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." This declaration, which to the ears of the Sanhedrin sounded like unforgivable blasphemy, unleashed a storm of indignation. Caiaphas, tearing his garments in a ritual gesture of religious horror, exclaimed, "He has blasphemed! What need have we for any more witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is deserving of death," responded in unison the voices of the Sanhedrin members. The sentence was passed. Only confirmation from the Roman governor was pending, for the Jews did not have the authority to impose capital punishment. In the courtyard, nearly 2 hours had passed since Peter's first denial. The apostle, growing increasingly nervous, attempted to blend in with groups excitedly discussing the events of the trial, but his accent betrayed him once again. "Surely you are one of them too, for your very way of speaking gives you away," they said. A relative of Malchus, the man whose ear Peter had cut in the garden, added, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Cornered, Peter began to curse and swear, "I do not know that man you speak of." At that very moment, a rooster crowed in the distance, breaking the pre-dawn silence. Simultaneously, the courtroom doors swung open to admit Jesus, who was being led by the guards, to another section of the palace. Their eyes met briefly. Jesus' eyes, full of love and sorrow. Peter's, suddenly illuminated by the memory of the prediction, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." The weight of his betrayal fell upon him like a mountain. He hurriedly exited into the deserted street and wept bitterly, with sobs that seemed to tear his heart apart. The tears of repentance, shining in the light of the first pale stars, marked the beginning of his redemption. Chapter 6. Jesus before Pilate and Herod. The dawn tinged the white walls of Jerusalem in a pale pink as the members of the Sanhedrin, leading the bound Jesus, made their way to the Praetorium, the official residence of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. The multitude, incited by the priests, began gathering in the square in front of the palace. The cool morning air did little to ease the tense atmosphere, filled with hostility and expectation. Pilate, a middle-aged man with sharp features and a penetrating gaze, received them with evident irritation. Dressed in a white toga edged with purple, a symbol of his authority, he stepped out onto the terrace overlooking the square. The Jews, careful not to become ritually unclean by entering a pagan's house on the eve of Passover, remained outside. This ritual scrupulousness, pathetically contrasting with the injustice being committed, elicited a sardonic smile from Pilate. "What accusation do you bring against this man?" he asked in a bored tone, as if merely going through a routine procedure. The chief priests answered evasively, attempting to pressure the governor into confirming their already pronounced sentence without further ado. But Pilate, suspicious and perhaps sensing a personal vendetta more than a case of true justice, insisted on questioning the accused personally. He led Jesus into the interior of the Praetorium, away from the shouts of the crowd. The encounter between these two men, one representing the greatest earthly power of the time, the other seemingly powerless yet invested with an authority that transcended human kingdoms, became one of the most dramatic moments in history. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked, studying with curiosity the abused man before him, searching his countenance for any sign of the royalty his accusers so vehemently attributed to him. Jesus' reply was enigmatic and profound. "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, my servants would fight so that I would not be handed over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from here." These words produced in Pilate a mixture of perplexity and fascination. "Then are you a king?" he persisted. "You say it, I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Jesus answered, with a serenity that contrasted with his pitiable physical state. "What is truth?" Pilate replied with a tinge of philosophical bitterness, and without waiting for an answer, returned to the terrace to announce to the Jews, "I find no guilt in this man." Faced with the furious insistence of the accusers, who mentioned that Jesus was a Galilean, Pilate saw an opportunity to rid himself of an awkward case by sending him to Herod Antipas, Tetrarch of Galilee, who was in Jerusalem for the festivals. Herod, a voluptuous and superstitious man who had ordered the beheading of John the Baptist, received Jesus with ill-health curiosity. He expected him to perform some miracle for his entertainment, like a court magician. He asked many questions, but Jesus remained utterly silent before him. Irritated by what he considered a slight, Herod retaliated by dressing him in a white tunic, the color worn by lunatics or candidates for honorary positions, and sent him back to Pilate amid the jeers of his soldiers. Thus, the Son of God was once again led through the streets of Jerusalem, which were beginning to fill with early pilgrims, in a back-and-forth procession that piled humiliation upon humiliation. Chapter 7. The Flagellation and the Crown of Thorns. The Praetorium's courtyard, paved with large polished stone slabs, became the stage for the next phase of Jesus' punishment. In its center stood the flagellation column, a robust marble structure with iron rings at its top. The executioners, 6 burly men with embittered expressions, prepared their instruments with professional precision. Leather whips with small bones, or metal balls on the tips, flexible rods, and hardened leather straps. Pilate, after a new failed attempt to release Jesus by offering as an alternative the notorious criminal Barabbas, decided to impose a punishment less severe than crucifixion, hoping that the sight of the flogged prisoner would satisfy the crowd's bloodthirst. "I will punish him and then release him," he had said, underestimating the implacable hatred of the priests and the fickle mood of the people who, incited by them, were now clamoring for Barabbas's release. The executioners roughly stripped Jesus of his garments, tearing away the clothing that had clung to the wounds already incurred during the night's abuse. They left him only a short cloth around his waist, a final remnant of dignity. His hands were bound to the upper ring of the column, stretching his body in such a way that only the tips of his toes touched the ground. This position, designed to tighten the skin and maximize the effect of the lashes, left the victim completely defenseless. The blows began to fall like an unrelenting rain upon his back, shoulders, legs, and sides. Each strike carved furrows in his flesh, splattering blood on the walls and floor. The executioners took turns in pairs, replacing each other when fatigued, to maintain the intensity of the punishment. Their faces, smeared with sweat and blood, revealed a mixture of routine indifference and a sadism fueled by the wine they occasionally drank to keep their vigor up. Roman law limited scourging to 40 blows, but in Jesus' case, that restriction was ignored. The flagellation went far beyond the usual, turning his body into an unrecognizable mass of torn flesh, exposed bones, and oozing blood. Despite the extreme pain, not a single complaint or plea escaped his lips, only small involuntary moans, and the sound of his labored breathing accompanied the crack of the whips and the occasional laughter of the onlookers. Roman soldiers, praetorium servants, and some Jews who had been allowed to witness the punishment. When at last they unbound him, Jesus collapsed to the ground, unable to stand by himself. They barely gave him time to catch his breath before subjecting him to a new humiliation, the crown of thorns. One of the soldiers retrieved a thorny branch with long spines and braided it into a crown. Others found an old purple cloak and a reed to use as a scepter. They seated him on a low stool, draped the cloak over his bloodied shoulders, and pressed the crown onto his head with such force that the thorns pierced his scalp, forming a circle of bleeding spots that dripped over his face. Mingling with his sweat and involuntary tears, the blood trickled down his forehead, clouding his vision and staining his beard a dark red. "Hail, King of the Jews!" The soldiers jeered between bursts of laughter, kneeling in mock reverence before him. One after another they approached to spit on him, slap him, or snatch the reed from his hands to hit him on the head, driving the thorns even deeper. This cruel spectacle continued until Pilate, thinking that such a display of misery might finally satisfy the hatred of the accusers, ordered that they lead Jesus back to the terrace. Chapter 8. Exe Homo and the Sentence. "Exe Homo, behold the man!" Pilate exclaimed, pointing to Jesus, who appeared on the terrace, covered in blood, wearing the crown of thorns on his head and the purple cloak on his shoulders. A murmur ran through the crowd filling the square, a mix of astonishment, horror, and among some, compassion. The Roman governor had thought that this moving vision of the prisoner reduced to such a pitiable state would quell the vengeful demands of his accusers. He was mistaken. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" The high priest began to shout, and soon the entire crowd joined the macabre chorus. Their faces, contorted with hatred, transformed until they lost every human feature. Some clenched their fists, others pointed accusatorially, all united in a frenzied outcry demanding blood. A dark, almost tangible energy seemed to seize the square, enveloping everyone except for a small group of Jesus' followers who observed the scene from a distance, paralyzed by horror and helplessness. Pilate, irritated both by the obstinacy of the Jews and by his own inability to resolve the situation, spat out sarcastically, "Take him and crucify him yourself, for I find no guilt in him." The priests, understanding that they needed an accusation that would hold weight under Roman law, changed their strategy. "We have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he has made himself the Son of God." The mention of the divine sent a shiver of superstitious fear through Pilate. The warnings of his wife, Claudia Procula, who that very early morning had sent a message urging him to have nothing to do with that righteous man, returned to his mind. He once again led Jesus into the praetorium and asked him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, "Where are you from?" Jesus' silence exasperated Pilate, who added arrogantly, "Do you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power either to release you or to crucify you?" Jesus' response was as unexpected as it was profound. "You would have no power over me if it had not been given from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has a greater sin." These words, far from offending Pilate, so impressed him that he resolved once more to set him free. But the Jews had one final ace up their sleeve. "If you release this man, you are not an ally of Caesar. Anyone who makes himself a king is against Caesar." The mention of the emperor and the implicit threat of treason charges struck at Pilate's most vulnerable point. His position was already precarious due to earlier conflicts with the Jews. An accusation of negligence in favor of a supposed rival to Caesar could cost him not only his position, but also his life. His sense of justice, already flexible, finally yielded to the instinct of self-preservation. Even so, he wished to record his disagreement with the sentence that was about to be pronounced. He called for water, and before the crowd washed his hands, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood, it is yours." The response of the people, which would echo as a curse throughout the centuries, was swift. "His blood be upon us and our children." With a brusque gesture, Pilate pointed at Jesus and pronounced the formal sentence, "Ibis ad crucem," "You will go to the cross." Fate was sealed. Human justice, bent by fear and political expediency, had condemned the righteous par excellence. Orders were given to prepare the crosses, Jesus in the center, taller than the two thieves who were to be executed with him, and the preparations for the final torment began. Chapter 9. The Via Dolorosa. The sun was rising in the Jerusalem sky, promising a hot, sweltering day. The streets leading from the Praetorium to the small hill called Golgotha, the place of executions, began to fill with curious onlookers, drawn by rumors that spread like wildfire about the condemnation of the famous Galilean preacher. The windows and terraces of the houses overlooking the route filled with expectant faces, some mocking, some indifferent, a few compassionate. Back at the Praetorium's courtyard, the soldiers returned Jesus' garments to him, now soaked in blood, roughly yanking away the purple cloak that had clung to the open wounds of the flagellation. Every movement was a new torture, every piece of clothing placed upon his lacerated body a fresh torment. The cross, a heavy wooden structure freshly cut, was brought and placed upon his shattered shoulders. The horizontal beam, the patibulum, rested upon the nape of his neck while his arms were tied to it with ropes to hold him in position. The funeral procession began. At its head rode a Roman centurion on horseback, followed by 4 soldiers blowing trumpets at the corners to announce the execution. A 5th soldier held a placard inscribed with the charge, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," in Latin, Greek, and Aramaic. Behind, staggering under the crushing weight of the cross, went Jesus, surrounded by soldiers holding ropes tied around his waist to prevent any attempt at escape and to drag him whenever he fell. The 2 thieves, carrying only the horizontal bar of their crosses, closed in with more guards and an ever-growing crowd of spectators. The road to Golgotha, little more than half a kilometer long, became an endless via crucis. The uneven stones of the pavement, often slippery with debris thrown onto the street, made each step a struggle. Jesus' legs, weakened by blood loss and the lack of food since the Last Supper, barely supported him. His breathing was laborious, punctuated by pain and effort. Sweat mixed with blood fell from his brow, blurring his vision, while splinters of the freshly cut cross gouged into his flesh. At the intersection of 2 streets, where the path made a sharp turn, Jesus tripped over a jutting stone and fell to his knees for the first time. The weight of the cross crushed him against the ground, further scraping his skin against the rough stones. The soldiers brutally pulled on the ropes to lift him up, adding insults to the blows. "Get up, King of the Jews! Is this the throne you have chosen?" They mocked as they forced him to continue. Shortly after, on a narrow street in the lower part of the city, Mary, the mother of Jesus, accompanied by John and several devoted women, managed to approach the edge of the road. The encounter between mother and son was brief but heart-wrenching. Their eyes met, conveying in an instant all the love and pain that words could not express. Mary, whose heart was breaking as Simeon had prophesied, tried to come closer, but the soldiers brusquely turned her away. In a final, mighty effort, Jesus whispered, "Mother," before being pushed onward. The road grew ever steeper as they neared the city walls. The burden of the cross seemed to increase with every step. Jesus' strength was abandoning him. His body had known no rest since the previous afternoon. He fell for the second time, with even more violence than before, his face striking the stones. Blood burst forth from fresh wounds on his face, mixing with the dust to form a reddish mud. Fearing that he might die before reaching the place of execution, the soldiers decided to force a bystander to carry the cross. Simon of Cyrene, a farmer returning from the fields, was seized by the soldiers and compelled to bear the beam. Initially reluctant and resentful at being drawn into such a degrading spectacle, his attitude changed upon coming into contact with Jesus. Something in the condemned man's eyes, a mixture of gratitude and infinite compassion, touched his heart. Unwittingly, Simon became a symbol for all humanity, called to share Christ's cross so as to find not a curse, but a path to salvation. Chapter 10. The Crucifixion. Golgotha, a small rocky outcrop located outside the walls of Jerusalem, received its name, the place of the skull, because of its rounded shape reminiscent of a human cranium. According to ancient tradition, beneath this hill lay buried the remains of Adam, the first man. It was a desolate place used for public executions, where the stench of death pervaded the air and vultures circled overhead, waiting for their grim feast. When the procession reached the place, the soldiers formed a circle to keep at bay the curious crowd that had gathered to witness the spectacle. The preparations for the crucifixion began with methodical efficiency. While some dug the holes in which the crosses would be planted, others prepared the nails, hammers, and ropes necessary for the torment. The condemned were offered a mixture of wine with myrrh and gall, a narcotic beverage meant to dull their senses and ease the pain. The two thieves drank it greedily, but Jesus, having barely moistened his lips, rejected the drink. He would face his supreme sacrifice fully conscious. They stripped Jesus of his garments, causing indescribable pain, as the tunic clinging to his wounds was ripped away. His nudity, especially shameful in Jewish culture, added humiliation to the physical torture. The soldiers spread the cross on the ground and laid Jesus upon it. One soldier placed his knee on Jesus' chest to immobilize him, while another held out his right arm, stretching it until it reached the pre-drilled hole in the wood. A third soldier, the most experienced, drove a thick, long nail through the palm, precisely where the carpal bones meet, and delivered the first hammer blow. The metallic sound of the hammer striking the nail reverberated over the hill like a sinister thunderclap. Jesus' body tensed in an agonizing spasm as the nail pierced flesh, tendons, and finally the wood. A suppressed groan escaped his dry lips, yet no curse, no plea for mercy was offered. The same process was repeated on his left hand, but they found that the arm did not reach the prepared hole. They then violently pulled his limb, dislocating the shoulder until they were able to position it for the second nail. For his feet, they first bent Jesus' knees, placing his left foot over his right. A nail longer than the previous ones was driven through both feet simultaneously, fixing them to a small support, a suppedaneum, nailed to the vertical post. Blood gushed abundantly from the 3 wounds, running down on the light wood that swiftly turned a dark red. With ropes and pulleys and the effort of several men, the cross was slowly raised until it stood vertical. As it fell into the prepared hole, the entire structure shuddered violently, inflicting immense pain on the suspended body. The full weight of Jesus now rested on the nails, further tearing his flesh. With his arms outstretched, normal breathing was impossible. With each inhalation, he had to push himself up by relying on the footnail, scraping his lacerated back against the rough wood. Every breath became a new torment, a constant struggle that would prolong for hours. The soldiers then proceeded to crucify the 2 thieves, one on each side of Jesus. Meanwhile, they divided the belongings of the Nazarene in keeping with the Roman custom that allowed the executioners to claim the possessions of the condemned. The tunic, however, was a single piece, woven without seams from top to bottom. Instead of tearing it, they cast lots for it, unwittingly fulfilling the psalmist's prophecy, "They divided my garments and cast lots for my tunic." Pilate had personally drafted the sign that stated the reason for the condemnation. "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," the inscription read in 3 languages: Latin, the official language of the empire, Greek, the international language of the time, and Aramaic, the local tongue. The chief priests protested this inscription, which seemed to acknowledge Jesus' kingship as a fact rather than a mere claim. "Do not write King of the Jews, but that he said, 'I am King of the Jews,'" they requested. But Pilate, in one final act of defiance, remained firm. What is written is written. The crowd, initially excited by the morbid spectacle, began to divide into contrasting attitudes. Some continued mocking, challenging Jesus to prove his power by coming down from the cross. Others, deeply moved by the dignity with which he endured his torment, kept a respectful silence. A small group of devoted followers, led by Mary, his mother, John, the beloved disciple, and Mary Magdalene, approached as close as the guards allowed, determined to accompany their master to the very end of his agony. The sky, previously clear and bright, gradually darkened, as if all creation itself wished to hide its face from the spectacle of the Creator crucified by his creatures. Chapter 11. The 7 Words and the Death. As the crucifixion progressed, Jesus' suffering intensified. Every movement, every breath was torture. The sun, having reached its zenith, beat down relentlessly on the exposed bodies of the crucified, increasing the thirst brought on by blood loss. Unlike the 2 thieves, who alternated cries of pain with curses, Jesus maintained an astonishing silence, broken only by deeply meaningful words that would be remembered throughout the centuries as the 7 last words of Christ on the cross. "And I," the first of these words came forth as the soldiers cast lots for his garments. Lifting his head slightly, with a quavering yet audible voice, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." This prayer for his executioners, uttered amid the most atrocious torment, moved some of those present. A Roman soldier named Longinus, who had taken part in the crucifixion, felt something stir within him upon hearing that plea for forgiveness, so contrary to any normal human reaction. Beside him, the 2 thieves displayed opposing attitudes. One of them, called Gestas, joined in the crowd's mockery. "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other, Demas, reproved his companion. "Are you not even afraid of God, while under the same punishment? We indeed deserve our sufferings, for we have received the due for our deeds, but this one has done nothing wrong." Then, turning to Jesus with a pleading look, he added, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus' response, the 2nd word, was immediate and consoling. "Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Thus, even amid his own agony, Christ continued his salvific mission, welcoming the repentant sinner. At the foot of the cross, the small group of loyal followers had come as close as the guards would allow. Mary, supported by John and the other women, beheld her son's torment with unspeakable sorrow. Their eyes met, silently conveying all the love that bound them. Concerned for her future in a hostile world, Jesus spoke his 3rd word, addressing Mary, "Woman, behold your son," and then to John, "Behold your mother." In that solemn moment, the beloved disciple was entrusted with the mission of caring for Mary as his own mother, a symbol of the new spiritual family that would emerge from the cross. Around midday, an unnatural darkness began to spread over the land. It was not a mere eclipse, an impossibility during a Passover full moon, but something deeper and more ominous, as if all of creation were clothed in mourning for the imminent death of its creator. This gloom, which lasted 3 hours, plunged Jerusalem into a profound silence. Many onlookers, frightened by this celestial sign, abandoned Golgotha to seek refuge in the city. Around 3 in the afternoon, when the darkness had reached its peak, Jesus cried out powerfully the 4th word, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This heart-rending cry, quoting the beginning of Psalm 22, revealed the depth of Christ's spiritual suffering. In that moment, bearing all the sins of humanity, he experienced the most terrible abandonment, the separation from God the Father, with whom he had enjoyed perfect communion from eternity. Shortly thereafter, aware that everything was about to be fulfilled, and to complete the scripture, he said, "I thirst," the 5th word. Moved perhaps by compassion, one of the soldiers soaked a sponge in vinegar, placed it on the tip of a hyssop reed, and brought it to his lips. This seemingly minor gesture fulfilled another ancient prophecy. They gave me vinegar to drink when I was thirsty. After tasting the vinegar, Jesus uttered the sixth word, "It is finished." It was the triumphant declaration of one who had perfectly completed the task entrusted to him. The work of redemption was accomplished. The full price for our ransom had been paid. The battle against the powers of evil was decisively won. Finally, gathering his last remaining strength, Jesus lifted his eyes to the clearing sky and pronounced with a powerful voice the seventh and final word, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." With this expression of absolute trust, he bowed his head and yielded his spirit. It was not merely a death, it was an act of voluntary surrender, the supreme sacrifice of the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. At the very moment of his death, the earth trembled violently. Huge rocks split, tombs were opened, and according to some testimonies, the bodies of many saints who had died were resurrected. In the temple in Jerusalem, the veil that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest was torn from top to bottom, symbolizing the end of the separation between God and man. The Roman centurion in charge of the guard, awed by all he had witnessed, declared, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Thus, the first official recognition of Christ's divinity came from a pagan, a portent of the future universal expansion of the gospel. Chapter 12. The Descent and the Burial. The afternoon advanced over Jerusalem when Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy and respected member of the Sanhedrin who in secret was a disciple of Jesus, appeared before Pilate. With a mixture of courage and urgency, he requested the body of the crucified man so that he might give him a proper burial before the Sabbath began. It was Roman custom to leave those executed on the cross exposed for days, subject to the elements and scavenging birds. But given that Jewish law forbade a body to remain unburied at sunset, especially on the eve of such an important feast, Pilate consented to the request. However, surprised by the rapidity of Jesus' death, since those crucified typically agonized for days, the governor asked the centurion for confirmation. When the centurion verified that Jesus had indeed died, Pilate granted permission. Joseph, accompanied by Nicodemus, another secret member of the Sanhedrin who had visited Jesus by night some time ago, went to Golgotha with clean linens, fragrant spices, and the necessary instruments for the descent. Nicodemus carried nearly 100 pounds of a mixture of myrrh and aloes, a princely quantity that revealed the depth of his devotion. Upon reaching the hill, they encountered a desolate scene. Most of the onlookers had departed after Jesus' death, leaving only a small group of faithful: Mary, his mother, supported by John; Mary Magdalene, inconsolable in her grief; and a few other devout women. The soldiers remained on guard, awaiting orders to remove the bodies. Seeing the two distinguished figures approaching with official documents, the centurion facilitated their task. The descent required both delicacy and strength. Joseph and Nicodemus placed ladders on either side of the cross. First, they removed the placard bearing the cause of the condemnation. Then, with tongs and hammers, they began the painful work of extracting the nails, taking care not to inflict further damage on the martyred body. The rusted iron creaked as it was pulled from the wood, a sound that made those present shudder. The nails, once removed, were respectfully collected by John and handed over to Mary, who received them as precious relics, holding them close to her chest. As the nails were taken out, Jesus' body gradually lost its grip on the cross. Joseph supported its weight from above, while Nicodemus received it from below. A large sheet was passed under the arms to facilitate the descent. With careful and reverent movements, as if handling an infinitely valuable treasure, they lowered the lifeless body to the ground, where Mary awaited with outstretched arms. The Virgin cradled her shattered son's body in her lap, in a scene that would be repeated throughout the centuries as a pinnacle of Christian piety. Her trembling fingers tenderly caressed his disfigured face, closed the eyes that had looked upon the world with so much love, and removed the thorns still embedded in his brow. Silent tears fell from the mother upon his wounds, mingling with the already congealed blood. Mary Magdalene, kneeling at his feet, kissed them fervently, recalling that earlier moment when she had anointed him with her tears and perfume. The preparation of the body for burial began right there, at the foot of the cross. With water brought from a nearby spring, they reverently washed every wound, every mark of the flagellation, every trace of blood and sweat. Then they anointed the body with the unguents and aromatic oils Nicodemus had brought, following Jewish burial customs. Finally, they wrapped the body in clean linens, placing the spices among the folds of the cloth. Everything was done hastily, but without recklessness, for the sun was quickly descending, and with it came the Sabbath, a day on which no work was permitted. Not far from Golgotha, in a nearby garden, Joseph of Arimathea owned a new tomb, hewn from rock, where no one had yet been laid. It was a dignified place, originally prepared for himself or his family, but now offered the master as one final service. 4 men carried the wrapped body to the tomb, followed by the small funeral cortege. The entrance to the tomb, low and narrow, led to a spacious chamber where a stone slab, carved like a bench, awaited to receive that precious deposit. With infinite care, they placed Jesus' body upon the cold stone. Mary bent down one last time to kiss the forehead of her son through the covering linen. Magdalene, inconsolable, nearly had to be pried away from her beloved master. John, remembering his promise to care for Mary, held her firmly at the moment of final separation. A large circular stone, which required the effort of several men, was rolled over the entrance of the tomb, sealing it completely. The setting sun stained the sky red over Jerusalem as the small group slowly withdrew from the tomb. The women, intently observing, memorized the exact location so that they could return after the Sabbath and complete the funeral rites in due time. None among them imagined that this tomb, destined to be the final stage of a tragedy, would 3 days later become the first setting for the greatest triumph in history, the victory of life over death, of love over hatred, of light over darkness. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, the high priests, recalling Jesus' predictions about his resurrection, requested from Pilate a guard to watch the tomb. "Sir, we remember that the impostor said while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So command that the tomb be secured until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come and steal his body and say to the people, 'He has risen from the dead.'" Pilate, already weary of the whole matter, replied dismissively, "You have a guard. Go, secure it as you know how." The priests then placed guards at the tomb and sealed the stone with the official seal, unaware that they were providing additional witnesses to the very event they wished to prevent from being proclaimed, the resurrection of the crucified. Thus, in the silence of the sealed tomb, while the Passover full moon rose over Jerusalem, concluded the most decisive day in human history. The Passion had ended, the glory was about to begin.